G'day guys, I recently released a 3-hour-long vlog covering the entirety of my trip to the WTC 2025, and I've decided what I want to do for convenience for you guys is break that down into 4 smaller clips so that you can more easily digest this amazing trip and experience. In this clip we're going to take a trip to Dubrovnik and we're going to talk about the role of the various people within the team, the captain's role, the coach's role, the player's role. We're also going to talk about the results and a little bit about the culture of the WTC and why it's such an amazing event to attend. And with that being said, let's jump into the video.
One for the Blood God.
G'day guys, with WTC 2025 now done and dusted, I'm taking a short break as a holiday to celebrate our results, and I've decided my first stop is going to be the beautiful Croatia, seeing the city of Dubrovnik. And I thought what it might be fun to do is talk about WTC, but with this as a beautiful backdrop. So let's go have an explore of the city. Alrighty guys, so the WTC is now done and dusted. We played 7 rounds of some of the most intense 40k that you'll ever see. It was an absolute blast. Team Australia won 5 out of those 7 rounds and placed 6th overall, which is a result that I'm immensely proud of. We placed 11th last year, 3rd the year before that, 1st the year before that, and 4th the year before that. So it's very good to just re-establish and assert that Australian Warhammer 40k is serious. And we have some very talented players, a very strong community, and it's also worth noting that very few of the people from those years where we came 4th, 1st and 3rd were on the team the years that we came for 11th and 6th. So it's not like we just have a few at the top that are carrying the team. We actually have a very deep pool of talent, and it's something that we are very proud of, and we work very hard to foster, and we make sure that, you know, people at the top are working closely with those just below them to make sure that we're lifting the quality of everybody in the nation. Fuck, this is a lot of stairs. So that's something we're really proud of, and it's something I'm personally very proud of, that I was able to, you know, take that Seed 1 position and defend it for multiple years. The first year that I took captaincy, pretty much the entire team, and this was the year that we came 3rd, pretty much the entire team were going to take a couple years off, and they were just like, yeah, we're not gonna play next year. Some other people can have a turn, and as a result, I took captaincy, and I was like, okay, it's going to be very hard to live up to that standard that has been set. You know, Australia's been established as an absolutely top tier nation, and, you know, maintaining that is not easy. It's no easy feat. So, you know, that was the goal. That was what I set out to do, and I essentially, you know, pulled some strings, called in some favors, got a couple of those outgoing players to return, which formed a core block of the team that was strong. And then I was able to use that core block of strong players to attract other top players from other parts of the country. You know, Australia's a massive country. You know, we had a bunch of people from Western Australia and a bunch of people from Victoria, and it's like the equivalent to flying to another country for most people. It's so far away, which makes practice hard, which makes community orientation hard. But so we roped in some people from there. We also roped in some people from New South Wales, put together a strong team. This is the previous year, and came 11th. And then this year we took largely the same team. I stepped down as a player into a non-playing captain role, which turned out to be one of the best decisions I've made in a long time, because it freed up a spot for us to get another player from New South Wales, Jordan McGregor, who was absolutely fantastic. We also replaced our arguably lowest performing player from the previous year and got a new player on who was also significantly better. And as a result, the team's strength went way up. We also, as captain, I learned a lot from the previous year, things that we could have done better, that we did do better this year. So we had a stronger, squad of players. We had more preparation, more experience, more understanding, and as a result, this year we were able to pull off that 6th place, which is something I'm very proud of. Some of the things that we did differently this year that might be worth talking about was we had a non-playing captain, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually quite impactful. I was able to rapidly respond to challenges, be present so that my players felt supported. I was able to focus on referee liaisons, building relationships with the referees, ensuring that all of the rulings there was a captain present for, to make sure that there was consistency. There was a few times where I was able to sort of point out that the ruling was made like this earlier, so it should be made like this now. And the referees agreed and made it in our favor. Whereas had I not been present, if I had been playing my game myself, may not have been able to do that. So there's just lots of things where it's like, super advantageous having a non-playing captain. Also, in the preparation and the lead up to the event, I was able to focus on getting everybody prepared instead of preparing myself. So I didn't need to play practice games. I didn't need to, focus on all of that sort of stuff. I was able to focus on getting their armies ready for them so that they can play their practice games. I was able to focus on booking things like accommodation, conference rooms, organizing shirts, organizing sponsorship deals, coordinating those payments, organizing transfers to and from the airport. I was able to just focus on all of that administrative bullshit and just tell the players, all you need to do, there's one thing you need to do, and that's be a good player. Be the best player you can be. I don't want them wasting their time on anything else. And I couldn't have done that if I was a player as well. I would have needed to either delegate that to somebody or, me sort out me and have each player sort out themselves. And that's not what you want. So, yeah, being the non-playing captain was an amazing win. It was so good. We also had the streamers on side this year. Organising the streamers for the event was really good. It's hard to deny that did come with some advantages, albeit very minor ones. But one of the advantages of having streamers there is that we were in the same area for the duration of the event. Like, we were essentially positioned right next to the air conditioner and didn't have to move around. Normally, as the pairings come out, you'll be paired on this group of tables into this nation, and then the next round you'll be on a different group of tables into a different nation. But because we had the streaming set up and it can't move, we were able to basically have a base camp, which was very, very helpful, very helpful. Now, that wasn't my intent when I got the streamers, but it was a very happy sort of side effect of having them. So, all in all, very happy with our results and very happy with, the decisions that led to them and what we did to make sure that we got those results. And I look forward to sort of exploring some ideas for next year and seeing what we can cook up. But yeah, I'm gonna continue exploring the city and I'll hit you guys with an update soon when I think of something else to talk about. Alrighty guys, I'm about halfway through my walk through the walls of Dubrovnik, and I thought I'd take a second to grab a seat, grab a drink, and have a bit of a relax, because there's about 850 billion fucking stairs in this joint, and it's I'm a fat cunt and it's quite the ordeal. So I thought I'd take a moment to take a seat, grab a drink, a watermelon spritz, because it's fucking a billion degrees as well. And update you guys on maybe talk a little bit about Team Australia's team strategy this year. So there's no surprise that team events are a different beast than singles. And one of the things that separates the high performing teams from the low performing is the team's overall strategy. So you could, in theory, just take your 8 best players, running their 8 best singles lists, and approach the event in that way. Or you could optimize for the things that are different in a team's environment and try to capitalize on those differences as part of your team strategy. So what we did last year is we designed 2 lists that were expressly designed around having specific tables. One of them, which was my list, was designed around taking the really heavy ones with tons of ruins and tons of protected objectives. So I could run my 30 Terminators and I could hop on the objectives and be safe and hold them. And then basically the idea is they wouldn't be able to attack me with shooting armies because they can't shoot me. And if they attack me with combat armies, that's exactly where I wanted them to be, right? So that was the strategy there. And then we would basically do the inverse for a shooting army. We'd design that to take the light tables and be like, cool, you can't hop out onto the objectives because we're just gonna shoot you off them, right? So last year we did a lot of what I would call optimization around the mission pack. The challenge that presented though was it kind of locks you in. So for example, I was kind of locked in as the Worldies player as a put up. I designed the list to be put up and it kind of had to be put up because if I don't get my table pick, I kind of just get blown out. And then what would happen is if we put me up, but then they have 2 lists in their lineup that happen to be really good into me regardless of table, you know, like it might be Death Guard, it might be, you know, Fights First, you know, things like that can be a real problem for Worldies at the time. And if they have both of those in their lineup, well now we can't put me up, because if we put me up, they're just going to attack with those 2 things and I'm going to lose my game. So it made it really difficult for us to adapt on the fly. The same thing could be said about the shooting lists that we designed as a put up on the shooting table pick, is it's kind of vulnerable to those sorts of things. So what we did this year that was different is we, instead of going for maximal optimization, we went for maximal like fluidity, maximum responsiveness, being able to go, cool, we've got like nothing's locked in, everybody's writing a really strong list. You can have certain matchups that you really like and certain tables that you really like, but nothing is locked in. And then the idea is that once we get to the table, we look at the lineup of the other team, and sometimes we'd be putting up our Blood Angels. Other times we'd be putting up our Imperial Knights. Other times we'd be putting up our Chaos Space Marines, right? Like we would mix it up heavily. And that does a few things that I think contributed to our success this year. One of them was that it made it so that our opponents couldn't predict us. Even if they went and asked our previous round opponents, like, who did Australia put up first? They're gonna get 3 different answers, right? Because we put up somebody different every round. And as a result, it gets really hard for them to predict us. Whereas when we ask their previous opponents, who did they put up first? They tell us the same thing, and then we know who they're very likely to put up first. And then we can adapt that into our pairing strategy, because we know that if that's a put up, they can't use it to pin something. So we can put up something that is vulnerable to the thing that we know that they are gonna put up. And as a result, we were able to get a really good results on the pairings, because instead of like maximizing things, we've like optimized for that ability to adapt on the fly. So you can see that in our pairings. I'm not entirely sure, I'd have to look at the numbers, but I don't think we put up the same person more than twice. Like we put up a couple of them twice, but most of the time we would change it and adapt. And that was really, really influential. It also insulates you against making the wrong call. Like if you design a list and you're like, it's gonna be a put up and I'm gonna put it up on these tables, and then turns out that somebody in the meta has solved it, well, now you're kind of fucked because you don't have a plans B through C through D, right? Whereas what we had, the way we had it done was we could look at the matrix and be like, yeah, cool. Let's say we're going to put up our Death Guard. If they're going to pin the Death Guard, they're probably going to pin it with like, you know, say Chaos Knights and fucking whatever, like Necrons, hypothetically. Well, if the rest of our lineup is bad into those, it doesn't really matter that we're getting pinned. So we can put up something that's going to get pinned by something that we kind of want them to pin us with. Whereas if you've designed something to be a pin, you kind of don't have that fluidity, you don't have that flexibility. So being able to adapt on the fly was a really key element of Team Australia's strategy this year. And that extends beyond just on the day as well. Like our strategy when it came to faction selection was to basically provide the players with maximum capacity to be as fluid as possible. In the past, we've really focused on faction mastery, and we want the same player playing the same faction for a long period of time because, you know, we've all had those situations where we know something about our faction that nobody else does because it's this really rare trick that we can use one in every 50 games that nobody knows about, nobody learns about, but we know about it, and that's a huge advantage. So that's something Team Australia has been really heavily focused on in the past, and we didn't want to take away from that focus. But basically what I did was a very laissez-faire approach where I basically encourage the players, like if you've got an idea of something else that you want to do it. You don't have to stress about, you know, whether or not it's going to work or, you know, just do it. Just like a real get it done kind of attitude of just, you know, if you try 100 different ideas and then none of them work, you can always go back to your original plan. It's sort of like, I remember watching an interview with Jeff Bezos where he was talking about this, where there's two types of doors. There's doors that you can go through and then you can go back through if you don't like what's in there. And then there's doors you can go through, but then they close behind you. And basically the only decisions he's interested in being involved in are the ones where the door closes behind you. And I had that same sort of approach with my team where it was like, cool, you're on Emperor's Children, and if you want to explore another faction, just do it. You know, because if it doesn't work, you can always just go back to your Emperor's Children. It's only when we get to a point like list submission, for example, where once those decisions are made, that door shuts. You can't change it at that point. That's the point when I wanted to be maximally involved. But outside of that, I gave my players all the freedom they want to be as adaptive as possible, which really helped us out when the Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights update dropped, because it was such a huge shake-up to the meta that if we weren't in that adaptive mindset, we may not have been able to adapt to it in time. And whether that be adapt into it as in provide solutions to kill the Knights, or fielding the Knights ourselves, or what we ended up on, which was kind of a bit of both, right? But that adaptive mindset is one of the main contributing factors to the team's overall strategy, was just be fluid, be adaptive. You guys are the best players in the nation. You guys are absolute killers. You guys are brilliant strategists and tacticians. I have no doubt that wherever we land is going to be the best place that we could land. So explore, go forth and, you know, do your thing. And we actually had a few last minute changes. Like Reese Cunningham was on Emperor's Children almost the entire time, all the way up until literally the day before list submission. We had a boot camp in Sydney where we basically a bunch of the members of the team flew to one of our teammates' houses. He put us up and we had games and shit all that weekend, and list submission was due the Sunday night. And basically the plan was this was going to be our final opportunity to test things before we submitted our lists, and then we were going to submit them all together as a team. So we did that, we had our games, and literally on the Sunday morning, Reese was like, I don't think Emperor's Children work. And everyone was like, what do you mean? Lists are due tonight. But basically we played a bunch of practice games into Knights, and we found that the Emperor's Children got smashed by them, and they got smashed by Death Guard, and they got smashed by Blood Angels, and they got smashed by, and it was like, okay, well hang on, if it's getting smashed by 6 out of the top 8 lists, like cool, it beats Eldar, who gives a shit? So we were just like, well, you know, we decided we were going to be maximally adaptive this year, so let's adapt. And Reese, luckily, is a Sisters player from years back. You know, he was our Sisters player last year. He's been the Sisters player for Team Victoria for several years. He's a bit of a master on the Sisters. So we were like, yeah, just pick it back up. It's fine. and he just jumped, like, literally wrote a list then and there and submitted it. And like, obviously that's not optimal. And during the event, there was a few moments where Reese admitted to me that like he should have had 2 priests instead of the 1, for example. Like there was some minor tweaks he wanted to make to the list, but obviously it's too late. And it's easy to look at that and be like, yeah, the list was undercooked. But you know what would have been worse? If we were too rigid and we forced him to stay on Emperor's Children, because that's what he'd been practicing on and that's what the rest of the team were built around. We were assuming we have an Emperor's Children player. And if he had been rigid and had stayed on Emperor's Children, he would have performed significantly worse. So being able to just go, cool, I trust my players with my life, get the fucking best list you can find, and feel empowered to make those sorts of changes if you feel it's necessary. That was a real core element of my leadership strategy this year, and the team's overall strategy was just maximal player empowerment. But yeah, I'm gonna finish my watermelon spritz and continue my walk around this epic city. One of the other great things about the WTC is the culture of shirt swapping and dice swapping. This shirt that I'm wearing now was from the captain of Team Netherlands. We did a swap at the end of the day, and it's a really cool way that we can sort of share our culture, share our experience, and give each other sort of a bit of a souvenir from the event. It's really, really cool. There's some really awesome designs out there, and the teams like to put as much of their culture into their shirts as possible so that you can sort of, you know, share that around, and because obviously being a huge event with several days of War Masters and several days of the team's event, most players need, in order to represent their team the whole time, need to get their hands on like 6 to 7 shirts. But obviously once the event's completed, you don't want 6 to 7 of the same shirt. So that's why we do this sort of shirt swapping process where, you know, after each round, you talk to your opponent, and if they're happy to, you do the same size, you can swap shirts, or you can organize swaps with somebody else on the team, or you can, you know, go around to other countries and get shirt swaps with them as well. This year, I ended up with a Netherlands shirt, a Finland shirt, an Ireland shirt, an Israel shirt. What else did I get? I got a Latvian shirt. The Latvian shirt, I think, is probably my favorite. They've got some really cool stuff on their shirt. And now there's people out there in the world representing Australia because they've got my shirt. And it's just a really cool way of expanding your wardrobe. I pretty much exclusively own Team 40K shirts at this stage because this is my 3rd year of WTC, so my wardrobe's fucking packed full of them. But yeah, it's super cool. The other thing that's really cool is the dice swaps. We do that every year as well. Obviously every team gets a ton of dice made. Well, not every team, but most teams get a ton of dice made with their national designs on them, and you swap them with your opponents so that you can have a bit of a souvenir as well. One thing Team Australia did this year, which was different to previous years, is we actually got like 4,000 dice made so that we would have enough to do a dice swap with every single person at the event. Even people who didn't have dice, we just gave them a stack of dice. And as a result, I now have every dice at the event. I haven't sorted through them yet, obviously, because I'm on holidays, but it's pretty cool. There's some really ripper designs in there. Once I get back to Melbourne, I might, you know, sort them all out and do a video, get you guys to maybe vote on which one you think is the coolest. But it's just a really awesome souvenir. I'm planning to take one of each dice and frame them as just a memory of the trip, and then keep a bunch for rolling dice in games. So yeah, that's just a bit of an update on the culture of the WTC, where the teams, like, you're not going to swap shirts with somebody that you hate, you know? So it just goes to show that, you know, the WTC really is a place where sportsmanship thrives and camaraderie and mateship is forged. And Croatia is where steps are fucking forged, because goddamn, there's a lot of steps here. But all right guys, I'll hit you guys back with another update shortly. So I spoke a little bit about the culture of the WTC with the shirt swaps and the dice swaps, etc. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the culture of Team Australia itself, because there's no doubt that we have a relatively unique culture. So I'm going to grab a seat and explain a little bit about how Team Australia approaches the WTC in general from a perspective of team culture. So I'm a strong believer that culture within a team is one of the pivotal parts of any team's success or lack thereof. If you have a really toxic culture, you're going to struggle to get that success. And if you have a very positive culture, it can go a long way towards contributing to your success. So one of the things we do in Team Australia is we make sure that not only do we have a very hard-nosed, competitive culture which demands merit, demands results, and is very, very pro-competitive mindset, we also go to arguably ridiculous lengths to ensure that our culture also reflects the jovial nature of the Australian community by making sure that our players are maximally free to enjoy the trip as a holistic experience. We have tons of memes, tons of zings, tons of banter. We don't encourage any player to take themselves too seriously. Everybody is, you know, free for jokes. You know, you can be the punchline of anyone's joke. They can be the punchline of your joke. And I'm a strong believer that that builds a sense of camaraderie between you and your fellow teammates, even though there will be contentious times because there are obviously egos at play. But I think that that also creates a bit of a pressure release as well. The WTC is the highest pressure event that you can attend in the terms of Warhammer 40k. Like the pressure that the players are under is absolutely immense. And if you don't have that release valve and you don't give players the opportunity to sort of, you know, alleviate that pressure through a bit of laughter, a bit of banter, a few trolls here and there, and a couple of zings, if you don't do that, that pressure builds up and then it causes people to have anxiety. It causes people to overthink things. It causes people to panic when they're in difficult situations, and that can cause you to lose rounds. So, you know, we go to a lot of effort to make sure that we're, you know, providing experiences for our players where they can sort of let some of that pressure go, you know, relax a little bit, have a little bit of fun with it, not take it too seriously, whilst simultaneously reinforcing that competitive, serious mindset. It's a very delicate balance to sort of strike, and I mean, we don't always do it amazingly. Sometimes we probably go a little bit too far in the silly direction. Other times we might go a little bit too far in the hyper competitive. I'm sure every team has similar dynamics. But this is something that as captain of Team Australia, I've been very conscious of, because a lot of our success, for example, the year that Team Australia won the event, we also won Best Sports. And that's because everybody was having an amazing time. You know, people were laughing and playing around and being silly and having a ton of fun. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that the year we won Best Sports, we also won the event overall. There's a few things that we do specifically. So one of them is our chant that we do before every round. You know, the team huddle up and we do our chant. And the typical Aussie chant is Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi. Whereas one of the things that we've done this year and the previous years is replace the oi, oi, oi part of the chant. There was years where we had big dick energy. There was one where we had balls on chin. Then in the previous year, we had Solly Fucks to Jeremy, which was a ton of fun. And then this year, we mixed it up between rounds. So as the trip progressed and as the event progressed, we changed the chant to reflect the funny thing that happened last night. And that's a good way of, when you're doing your huddle, you're about to go into the round, you're about to face off against some of the best players in the world. It's a good way to just remind the team of how much fun we had last night, you know? And it really alleviates the pressure. One of the other things that we do is during the pairings exercise, when we're putting forward our pairings cards and flipping them and revealing who's getting paired into who, we do a big ooh-ah clap. So basically what happens is as the first put up gets put forward, we go ooh, and then when it's revealed, we go ah. And then when we're paired in, we go hey, and we clap. And it's ridiculous and it's stupid, but it's funny. And the team love it. And the amount of times that the other teams will start joining in, where as they're putting up their things, they'll hit us with an ooh-ah, and then they're all laughing. It's so funny, and it's such a great way to build that relationship with the opposing team during that pairings exercise, which is typically one of the most intense parts because you're trying to outthink and outwit your opponent's strategy. People are worried about what they're going to get put into. There's a lot of anxiety there. So being able to build that ooh-ah into that is so much fun. And we got to a point where we had, when we were playing against Sweden this year, we're playing Sweden, we're ooh-ahing, they're ooh-ahing, but all of the tables surrounding us were joining in on the clapping. And it was so funny. Like the whole event just gets into it. And that's an Aussie innovation, you know, the ooh-ah. And it's really funny because obviously it's 8-man teams. So there's several rounds of put up, reveal, pair. You know, that whole process happens several times. And we do it every time. And it's really funny because the first time we do it, it's like a 7 out of 10 funny. Then the next time we do it, it's like a 6 out of 10 funny. And the next time we do it, it's like a 5 out of 10 funny. But then the next time that we do it, it becomes like a 9 out of 10 funny. Because it's that joke that like, the more you do it, the more they realize, oh, this is funny. Oh, this is dumb. This is stupid. Oh my God, they're still going. You know, and it creates this really funny thing where it gets like less funny and then it gets way funnier. And yeah, a lot of the other teams really get into it, which was really, really cool. And that goes a long way towards building a much more holistic experience that the players enjoy every aspect of. And also, I genuinely believe that it contributes to our results. One of the other things is we like to be very generous in Australia. So this year I got 4,000 dice made so that everybody at the event could have a Team Australia dice, regardless of whether or not they brought their own dice. So that's an example of our generosity. And then I also made these gift packs that had like a little plush koala or kangaroo. It had 16 objective markers, 16 dice, 16 range rulers, a pack of Tim Tams, a pack of Vegemite, all of this sort of stuff that we could gift to the opposing team as a way of saying thank you very much in advance for being lovely opponents. And you know, we want to share Australian culture with you guys, hence the Tim Tams, the koala, and the Vegemite. There was one round where one of our players, Matt Morosoli, is notorious for getting his big toes sucked. He's had captains from Team Poland. He's had just numerous people have sucked his toe. And it's become a bit of a fable, a bit of a, you know, a bit of a moment that happens in WTC history. And this year we took it to the next level where when we were doing the pairings exercise into Scotland, we actually got his toe, dipped it in the jar of Vegemite, and then had one of the Scottish coaches suck the Vegemite off of his toe. And it's like, this is just completely unnecessary, completely ridiculous, but so much fun, so funny that every team just gets in on it and they love it and they have a good laugh, and it makes the event more memorable, more enjoyable, and it definitely contributes to our results. Whether you're superstitious or not and you view it from that lens, or if you just view it from a human psychology lens where people tend to perform better when they're in a good mood, whereas when people are in a bad mood, they tend to close their mind a little bit more. So trying to make sure that people are in that good mood and trying to make sure people are relaxed, it generates creativity. It helps with problem solving for complex challenges. And I genuinely believe that that contributed to some of our success this year. Team Australia is comprised of more than just 8 world-class players. This year we actually took a squad of 16 to the event, so let's talk a little bit about those supporting teams, what their roles were, and how much impact they had on Team Australia's results for 2025 and how important they were. So we had obviously your 8 players, that locks 8 of them out, and we'll talk about those guys in a moment. But in addition to that, we had 2 people streaming for us for the entire event. We had myself as a captain, and then we had, so that's another 3 out of 16 plus 8, that's 11. So then we had another 5 people remaining. And those 5 people were our coaching staff. Now, the coaches are only permitted in the area if they're one of the 4 nominated playing coaches. And basically, in order to prevent teams from flooding the playing area, the WTC restricted it so that you would only get 4 playing coaches and a non-playing captain, and everybody else had to stay outside of the playing area. So what we did is we nominated our 5th coach to be our data smith, and their job was basically to monitor other rounds and return important information to the team so that we could keep up to date with how everybody else is going, keep up to date with how everybody else's pairings have gone, that sort of stuff. So that was one person. And then the other 4 were our playing coaches. And their primary role was any general support that any players needed. So this ranges from running errands, going and getting Panadol from the shops, going and getting, energy drinks and soft drinks, water, also observing challenging opponents. If there's an opponent that had questionable rules, for example, we would monitor them. Or if there was a particular game that was getting angsty, we would monitor them. And we basically just do that so that the players felt maximally supported, so that they weren't undue stress and that they weren't, feeling unnecessary pressure. There's something about having a faction master standing right beside you when you play Gene Stealer cults and you have no idea what the fuck Gene Stealer cult does. But you know that your coach is right next to you, he's got their book open and he knows everything they do. And that way you know that your opponent's not going to get any rules wrong and you're not going to miss it if they do, because you've got that support. And even though, to my knowledge, none of our opponents actually got rules wrong that required correction, there's something to be said for having somebody there observing and sort of providing that support. And then of course, when the rounds were going really, really well and we were under control, those people would then pivot from a coach role into more of a scout role. And in that scout role, they would essentially walk around the event and observe interesting matchups. So they'd go and watch, how does the Space Wolves army deploy when it's versing Imperial Knights? What does that look like? How do these weird fucking 100 Berserker lists perform? Like, what do they do? Do they put a unit of 20 in reserves, or do they just deploy it all on the table? Are they aggressive? Do they just send everything out turn 1, or do they hold it all and wait for a later turn? Gathering that sort of information, which they were then able to feed back to the teams, made our lives much, much easier, as we were able to effectively plan and predict what the opponent was going to do in their turns and in the way that they approached the pairings exercise. So that was a real critical component for the coaching team, and we would chop them in and out. So like I said, we were only allowed 4 in the playing space, and we had 5 people available plus the 2 streamers plus myself. But basically what we do is, if one person was like, I'm going to go do some scouting, we'd send them out, and then that other person, the data smith, was able to step in to the area. The data smith was a really important role as well. They were doing things like looking at key matchups that we think we're good into, but our opponent thinks we're bad into. So, for example, if the Eldari are consistently beating Imperial Knights at the event, but our Imperial Knights player thinks he beats the Eldari, our data smith would identify that, he would flag that, and then the team would review it. And maybe we're right, maybe our Imperial Knights has some special tech that makes them really good into the Eldar, Or maybe we're wrong and there's something we need to look into and we realize, oh wow, they can actually brick one big night with just the swooping hawks. That's a problem we didn't know about. And then we can amend our matrix to reflect that. So having that data smith on site, able to sort of continuously pull data from best coast bearings and continually update the team on how it was going down was really, really helpful. And basically what happened is when somebody needed to do a scouting mission, they would report to the data smith. So we might be like, yep, everything's under control here. Stewie, go report to Gashi and get your assignment. And then Gashi would go, okay, cool. I've noticed that this particular Imperial Guard list seems to be hunting Death Guard. It's played it 3 times already in the event and it's won all 3 of them. It's playing Death Guard again right now. Can you go observe it and see how he's beating them? Because it's all well and good to know that a certain matchup is favorable or unfavorable, but to know why is also really important. Because sometimes if they're hunting something and we know their trick, we actually want them to hunt us because we can set traps. So knowing how they win and what they're doing is really, really effective in terms of overall team strategy. So that was the scouts and the coaches and the data smith. And then the only other thing, which I'll do a separate video on, was me as captain and what my role was. One of the things that I really wanted to make sure we didn't get wrong was the way that the coaches interact with players, because this is something that can be fucked up really easily. So what we did is I basically implemented a rule where the only person that could initiate contact with a player was myself. If the coaches are hovering around and a player needs something, a player can initiate communication with a coach. You know, turn around and say, hey Stewie, go grab us a drink of water or whatever. But under no circumstances were coaches to initiate contact with a player. And that way it's almost impossible for our coaches to overstep or make any mistakes. We've had that in the past, not in Australia, but you know, the event has had in the past instances where the coaches actually caused more problems than they solved. Even this year, there was one point during one of the captains' meetings where the head referee said that they'd handed out a ton of warnings, but like 80% of the warnings were handed out to coaches because the coaches weren't following the rules for what non-playing members can actually do. So I was really strict on that, made sure that we were ticking all the boxes and that at no point were any of our coaches overstepping. And I'll do a separate video talking about my role as captain during the event, because obviously my role is multifaceted. There's things that I did in the lead up to the event, there's things that I did during the event, and now there's things that I'm doing post-event, all of which are very different. But I'll do a separate video talking about my role as captain during the event, because I'm going to need to bust out my laptop to show you guys some stuff. One of the most important parts of my role on the day as captain, in addition to like coordinating the team and making sure that everyone's at the right place and doing the right thing, was communicating and updating the scores. So getting information from my players about how they're tracking in their games and what their score is likely to be, and then communicating that with other players, and then making the executive decision on whether I want my players to push or whether I want them to play a stable game. Now, this can be quite complex, and there are a lot of specific rules on what I, as a non-playing member, can say to another playing member. For example, I can't give them information on the specifics of other games, and also if they give me specifics on their game, I have to refuse to comment. So for example, if they say, hey, I'm thinking about going for a charge, but it's a 9-inch charge, it's unlikely, do you think I should go for it or not? I have to walk away. I'm not allowed to comment on that. However, if they say, I've got an idea, it's probably an 80% fail rate. However, on that 20% chance that it does work, it's going to result in me getting a significantly higher score. Do we need that high score, or are we happy with a more conservative score? That they can say. And I can also advise them to seek those opportunities if I deem it necessary. So it's quite complex the way that this all sort of unfolds, and it's very difficult to navigate. Going around and asking for players for updates and then telling them to push arbitrarily actually does more damage to the players than help, because telling them to push, they're like, well, what does that mean? What do I do with this information? And why is this the case? You know, it can be quite complex. So what I created for Team Australia was a relatively basic tool, but it was also a very impactful one, which I'll show you now, which was, I'll just let the laptop boot up. But basically I created a point card that the players could point to scores on, and that way they were communicating to me what their projected score was likely to be without giving any of that information to the opponents. So basically what I do is I'd show the opponents the screen like so. I'm not sure if that'll show up on the camera, but it's basically a screen with a little table with a bunch of numbers from 1 to 20, all in green. And then it's got a few notes that they can point at. For example, trending upwards, trending downwards, stable or unstable. They can identify if they went first or second, whether they had favorable objective placement, and they can also, I can also communicate to them what the broader team score is. And the idea is I'd rock up to the table and I'd show my opponent first. I'd be like, I'm just going to show my player this screen so that they can point to some stuff for me, and then I'd flip it around like this and then get my player to look at it, making sure we're not touching the keyboard, so we're not tabbing to any other sheets or anything like that, just the sheet on the screen, and they would basically point at information and communicate that to me. And that way, basically what I'd do is, at the end of the round, we'd have a conversation as a team about whether or not our pairings went well. And if our pairings went well and we were, you know, projecting a win, well then the advice to everybody would be just hold, do whatever you think you need to do to conservatively score your projected score, right? Score that outcome. Whereas if we had unfavorable pairings and it's looking like we're going to lose the round because, you know, maybe we didn't get the matchups we wanted, well then the advice would be to 1 or 2 players, can you flip your matchup, right? And if you can, do those riskier plays in order to do so. So as a great example of this could be our Blood Angels list. It can play 2 play styles. It can either have everything hiding and send out units 1 by 1 to trade off of objectives, and it can get a 10-10 into almost anything on a favorable board or a reasonable board, and it can spike higher if it needs to, right? So what we'd do is we'd basically put in the conservative score as if you're playing that trading game, but if we're gonna lose the round, it'd be like, okay, just full send. Because if you full send and you hit them and then they counter and bounce, and then you roll over them, you can turn that into a big win. But if it fails, you'll turn it into a big loss. So you wouldn't want to do that if you were on track to win the round. However, if you were on track to lose the round, you might go, well, and we're going to lose the round anyway, so the downside of it becoming a huge loss isn't that bad, whereas the upside of you turning that into a big win could save the round for the rest of the players. So I would basically, as captain, I would look at our projected scores. I would go around, I'd use that laptop method to get updates regularly from the players. And I'd be like, okay, cool. You know, what's the projected score? Is it trending upwards or downwards? Is it stable? Those who say it's stable, I'd be like, cool, just keep it stable for now. And then if any of them were trending down and it was looking like we were now gonna lose the round, that's when you'd go around and you'd tell people, okay, now's the time to push. And part of the challenge of this is often that information, you need that early. You need that real early, because you can't suddenly push on turn 4 if you've been playing conservative all game. You know, that's not going to save you. That might, if you pull it off and it works for you, it might get you an extra 5 to 10 battle points. You know, it might get you an extra 1 or 2 on the differential. So it's not really that good if you do it late. So early in the round, we'd get our pairing starter, I'd update it, then I'd immediately do a whip around and be like, cool, did you go first or second? Because that can impact your score, you know? And then people would update their score. So they might have put it in as a 12 on the matrix, but they're going first and they kind of need to go second. So they'd tap went first, now it's a 10, you know? And then I'd update that. And then the next part of this, which this is something that I couldn't show the players, but I would do this at the same time as the updates on the same spreadsheet, was I would be tracking people's projections. So let's have a look at perhaps Norway's projections. So this is the projection screen here. And basically you can see that this is our player, this is their faction, this is the opponent's faction, this is our initial projection. And then basically I'd get an update straight away and go, you can see straight off the update that our CSM into their Blood Angels went from a 13 down to an 11. And that's because our player got the first turn. And having the first turn means you have to initiate those trades, which makes it really hard to play that conservative game because you have to put something out there knowing you can't kill anything. Then they respond by killing it and they get essentially the first drop. They also get the final say in that they get the final say on Deep Strike arrival. They get the final say on objectives when they get to do that big turn 5 playing second push to take objectives. So we went through and did a big update, and as you can see, our original projection was 84. However, after the update, our projection became an 92, right? So I was able to tell our CSM player, even though their score had gone down from a 13 to an 11, I was able to say, that's fine, man, just play for your 11. You don't actually have to win, you know? And, you know, then I was able to tell, because our Necrons player, he went up, our Sisters player went up, our Blood Angels player went up. Like a lot of these people on that first update, the first time I spoke to them, they're like, yep, this is gonna be a big win, a bigger win than I expected, which that allowed me to let the other players on the team know you don't need to stress too much. One of the big ones here was Greg with his 1,000 Suns into their Chaos Knights. He'd predicted a 4. It's like his worst possible matchup. After the first turn, he at that first turn update, he said it was probably more like an 8. He's like, I've got enough pieces that I can keep sending things out and sort of not trading because I can't kill the fucking things, but I can score all my secondaries. Like I'll just keep scoring secondaries. There's not much he can do to stop me. You know, I'll keep going out there and scoring, 5 primary a turn. So worst case scenario, it's actually not that big of a blowout. And I was able to tell him, look, that's actually just fine. You don't need to push for anything too crazy here. We'd actually survive with a 4. And he updated me and said, it's probably gonna be more like an 8. And I'm like, yep, lock that in. Just do whatever you need to do to secure that 8. So that's an example of the pairings going quite well, right? And the communication that I'd give to the players. And you'll notice that the language here is all about playing conservative or aggressive, pushing for opportunities, or playing to your sort of plan. These are all things we're allowed to say. What I'm not allowed to say is make sure you kill 2 big knights this turn. I'm not allowed to give actual in-game advice. I'm able to give broader strategic advice based on the team's general direction. Like it's okay for you to play for an 11 loss, or you need to do things to make sure that you get your 13, etc. But not every round was clean like that. So for example, in our Swedish round, we had a projected score of 81 off the start based on pairings, which is a win. It's a top side of a draw actually, because the WTC has a differential of 5 for score for draws. However, after our first whip around, in the first sort of battle round, almost all of our scores dropped by a point or 2, which pushed us down to a 71, which is no longer even in draw territory, it's in loss territory. So this is where it gets a bit hairy, because I then have to go around to the players and say, look guys, you've all given me your updates. Based on that, if everybody here achieves what they plan to, we're gonna lose the round. So then I have to talk to each player and say, do you feel that this is flippable, right? And by that I mean, like, is there a 5% chance that you could flip this? Is there a 10% chance you could flip this? Like, what are the risks? Are there risky things you could do to flip the game? And again, they can't tell me what those risky things are, because then that would be me giving them in-game advice. But basically, they would give me like probabilities, and then I would then go off, weigh up those probabilities, and decide which players on the team need to go for it and which ones shouldn't. So for example, if our Sisters of Battle player goes, yeah, I've got it marked down as a 12, but if I take some risks I could probably get it up to a 14, and there's about a 50-50 chance it works, right? So then I walk away and I'm like, cool, we got a 50-50 opportunity over here to gain an extra 2 points. But then I'd go to another table and they'd say, I've got this play, I think it'll work. It's like, I don't know, like an 80% chance, and it's gonna get me probably another 2 points, right? So now I know I've got an 80% chance for 2 points and a 50% chance for 2 points. What I would then do is I'd go around and say, cool, Sisters Battle player, don't worry about it, just play conservatively, get your 12, because our Blood Angels player has a better chance of getting us those 2 extra points, right? And doing that is a way of managing the team's overall strategy to ensure that we're not taking unnecessary risks in some areas because we have more reliable risks in other areas. Now, there's still risks, and there's still generally things you would rather not have to do. You know, I would rather look at the pairings matrix and be like, oh, we're projecting a win. Everybody just score your expected value. And then everyone does that and we win. Obviously that's the utopia, but often you'll find that one person's prediction drops, like they have a really bad turn, they lose a couple of important units, they drop, so then all of a sudden the team is now on track for a loss. So you then need to go and update everybody, because if you don't, we're gonna lose. So having that captain in that position, able to go around and find out who can turn it and who can't, very important. It's also really important for, like, if, for example, in the Swedish round, I did that. And one of the challenges to doing this is you're gambling, right? And sometimes when you gamble, you lose. And you find out, okay, we've got an 80% chance of getting an extra 2 points here, a 50% chance of getting an extra 3 points over there. So you give people all the advice, yep, do it, because if we land these 3 things, we get back into winning or draw territory. And then you give them that advice, and then you come around half an hour to an hour later, and they failed. And you're like, well, now we're going from a small loss to getting actually dumpstered. And that's unfortunately what happens sometimes. That is what happened to us in Sweden, is we basically projected that we were gonna get a loss. So we then went around and updated people, told them to take risks. They took the risks didn't pay off, and we lost even harder. And that's why sometimes when you look at WTC pairings and scores, when a team loses, they lose pretty hard. You know, they either get a draw or they lose hard, because the second you fall into we're going to lose territory, you kind of have no choice but to make like buck wild moves and essentially throw yourself either back into a draw or deeper into a loss. But that's sort of my call as the captain to make, and that's how I need to communicate that to the teams. And I use that laptop heavily to basically do a whip around, get everyone's updates, sit down, crunch the numbers, look at it, then do another walk around where I don't interact with the players. I just look at the game states, I just look at them, and I listen to the players, and I go, okay, this person's talking like they have opportunity and they have game. This person's clearly panicking and freaking out because they're getting dumpstered. And I basically have to then go back and make an informed decision on which players I'm gonna ask to push and which players I'm gonna let them know that it's okay to just play for your small loss. It's also worth noting that at some point, the writing's on the wall, where you look at it, you're like, okay, we're projecting, like for example, into Sweden, I think we were projecting 6 out of 8 games were gonna be losses, some of which were quite significant losses. So at that point, there's actually nothing that we can do to pull that back into a draw or a win, right? Because these players are all getting dumpstered. So basically what I'd do is I'd walk around, do a final update and be like, are you sure? Like, how stable is it? And people would say, yeah, it's a stable loss, right? Trending downwards, stable loss. And once everybody's confirmed that, it's like, okay, I would just go around to people and say, all right, for the next hour of the round, just have fun with it, man. Like, we've lost the round. You know, you can just, don't stress, don't put yourself under undue pressure, because I kind of view pressure as a resource that you have limited of, right? And if you're wasting it in certain rounds when there's a foregone conclusion, that's not wise, because people cannot be under that intense level of pressure for 7 straight games into the world's best players. It'll break them, right? And you want that pressure more than ever at the final rounds. So you don't want to waste it on round 4 or round 3 with people like just really stressing about their games and trying so hard to scrape for points and getting really emotionally invested in it and devastated when their things fail. And then all of a sudden there's like that pressure builds up, and it was for nothing because we'd already lost the round even if their things did go the way they wanted. So, you know, things like clock pressure, things like angsty debates and arguments with your opponents, all of that sort of stuff, it's not worth it when the data suggests that we're already losing the round. And as long as the team are accurate with their data and accurate with their predictions, then it is what it is, right? So that's when I'd go around and I'd update the players and be like, guys, we're going down to Sweden, you know, like, so don't stress, don't panic. We'll bring it back in the next round, but for now, just play out your games. Obviously, try to get as many points as you can. You don't want to just concede, because at the end of the day, the points will determine our placings. But don't get too angsty about it. Just go for it, right? And there's a few advantages to that as well. Like, so for example, I'll say all that to them in front of our opponents, right? And when the opponent hears that, they take their foot off the accelerator as well, right? Because they no longer need to be angsty about the little minutiae of it to try to deny you those points, because they know that they're winning anyway, right? So it's kind of almost a reverse psyop where I'm like communicating to them, I'm communicating to my players something that I want the opponent to hear, because it's going to impact their decision making. So that's a really important component of it as well, because then, you know, instead of it becoming a 50 to 110, it might be like a 65 to, you know, 125 or whatever, 115 or whatever the maths is. And as a result, they still get the win that they wanted, but now we get more points out of the loss, which then means we place higher. You know, we were on the same win-loss record as a few of the teams that placed below us, and that's because the wins that we got were big wins, and the losses that we got were seldom blowouts. You know, they weren't massive losses. We've scraped as many points out of that as we could, but in a very measured and calculated way. So that's the sort of summary of my role as a captain during the round. I also had to manage the support team, so I had to manage the other coaches, the streamers, and our data smith, and make sure that each one of those people were doing the right thing. So certain things like, for example, one of our players was experiencing clock difficulty. He was getting very close to clocking out multiple times. He never did, but he got close a couple of times, which was giving us a bit of a concern. So one of the things that I did is I made sure that my coaches were monitoring his clock and making sure that it was being used correctly. Because the last thing I wanted was for him to clock out and then be like, yeah, but we spent 10 minutes of your turn on my clock, and have that kind of awkward argument. So I was like, just coaches, just as you're doing your rotations through the tables, just every time you walk past this clock, check it and make sure that it is ticking down on the right timer, right? On the right player. And if you ever notice that, hang on, he's rolling dice, but that's my player's clock going down, immediately take a photo of the clock and let me know. We'll summon a referee and the referee will go and fix it. So that's the idea that was one of the functions of the non-playing members, the coaches. And that was something that I was able to adapt on the fly. Like, I just noticed on the fly that this one player was consistently having trouble with his clock. And it wasn't trouble in a negative sense. It was a trouble in that his army was a combat army. He's often in combat really early in the game, which means sometimes you walk past, everybody else is on turn 3 or 4, and he's still on top of turn 2 because he was in combat from turn 1, right? So it looks like, wow, he's significantly further behind than everybody else on the clock. However, his games were often finished by turn 3 because once you've been in combat for turn 1 and 2, your opponent's dead. And then the last few turns are like that, right? So that was one of the elements as well, was basically making those sorts of decisions on the fly and making sure that our coaches were active and engaged, because one of the challenges with being a coach is it can become boring as you're just like watching a game and you're just standing there and you can't interact, you know, and you see mistakes happening and you're like, oh, why is he doing that? There's nothing I can do about it. I'm not allowed to talk to him. So it can be frustrating and it can be tiresome. So one of the things that I did is a rotation where basically we had 4 non-playing coaches in that space, and basically each one would be assigned 2 tables, and then I'd rotate those tables throughout. So, it'd be like, okay, cool, Stewie's looking after these front 2 tables, then it's Sam, then it's Adam, and then it's, like Callaghan at the back, and then we'd rotate them and we'd basically go, Stewie, I want you to go swap places with Callaghan. And then Stewie would go to the back table and Callaghan would come to the front table. And that way they're not just staring at the one game the whole time. Sometimes that would be appropriate. So for example, if we had a Tyranids or a Gene Stealer Cult matchup, I'd want Stewie watching that because we didn't have those factions on our team. So we didn't have any experts in those factions. So making sure that we had somebody available to watch that game specifically was very useful. But generally speaking, we rotated them out. I made sure to manage their fatigue. I made sure that they were getting important updates. Like there were a few instances where, the player would say that they're a 12 to me, and then one of the coaches would be like, I've played this matchup a ton of times. I don't think he is a 12. I think he's probably going to get like a 13 or a 14, right? And if that was the case, if there was a disjoint between the player's prediction and the coach's prediction, I would then go and look at the table myself and see what my thoughts are. And if I thought that the player was accurate, I'd put in their score. If I thought the coach was accurate, I'd put in theirs. 90% of the time, I just went with the player as they're the one that's playing the game. It's all well and good for a coach to look at a table and think, oh, we're about to get a massive win because he's about to be able to go over here and charge that, tag all of this stuff. It's going to be a disaster for the opponent. But if our player doesn't see that same play path, if they don't see that, they're going to be like, oh, it's going to be like a 10-10. And the last thing I want to do is to have me and the coach walk over and see this trajectory that the player doesn't see, then put it in on the matrix and expect that outcome, but then have the player not deliver it because they couldn't see that path. So you almost always want to side with the player's prediction. There was only a few instances where I didn't, and that was instances where the player was playing against a faction they weren't super familiar with, and they actually said, ask the coaches to give an update on their prediction because I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's obviously something we want to avoid by having as many practice games into as broad of a range as possible, but you can't practice into everything. And also the quality of practice you get is going to vary heavily depending on the pilot of the opposing list. So it's not an exact science, but that's one of the mechanisms that we would use during the round to sort of secure the overall strategy of the team and make sure that we are still traveling in the direction that that strategy dictates. And if we needed to deviate from that, that's how I would make those decisions, by putting in that data and updating that tracker. And that way I could see, yep, where are we trending, where are we going up, where are we going down, and how do I communicate that? A lot of teams do a similar thing, but they use just like pen and paper and a notepad, and they'll write stuff down. Then a lot of teams will also have like a printout with not too dissimilar to what I did here. One of the advantages to the laptop method is I could change it on the fly. So for example, during, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd round, one of the players asked me how the rest of the team was going, and I wanted to provide that information without our opponent seeing it, right? And without them hearing it. So I didn't want to say, yeah, we're fucking smashing them, but I wanted my player to know that we were. So what I did is I added a column on the side that was, the team's predicted score, and I put like a 0 to 75, 75 to 80, 80 to 85, 85 to 90, and a 90 plus as the options in the grid. And then basically I'd show the laptop to my opponent, be like, this is what I'm going to show my player, and then I'd turn around and I'd point at the 90 plus. And that way I'm not showing the opponent that we're 90 plus. They know that I'm pointing at something on this table, but I'm able to communicate that discreetly to my player. And this was something that I realized I needed when a player asked me, how are we tracking? And I was just like, hang on one sec, I'll be right back. And I just quickly dipped out, added a few more columns, put in a few numbers, and then I was able to go back and show the opponent, this is what I'm going to show my player, and then flip it around and show the player the number. You can't do that if you're using pen and paper, or at least not as easily. You probably can if you're using a notepad with pen and paper, but yeah, it is what it is. This also makes it easy for the opponents to click on the big box numbers and stuff like that. I think it's just a very good system, and then it allows me to immediately then take that information, type it in, have it automatically calculate the differentials that we're expected, automatically sum up the scores that we're going to get across the team to determine if we're still on track for a win or a draw. Very effective method for managing the team's scores throughout the round. There was one player that took an issue with this, where they said, oh, but you could Alt-Tab to another screen that has like specific instructions for that specific player. Like I could open a Word document and I could write, hey man, make sure when you charge that you put yourself within pile-in range of this thing so that you can tag it so it doesn't shoot back or whatever. I could put all that in a Word document and then put that behind the spreadsheet and then just Alt-Tab. So I was like, oh shit, I didn't think of that. So I checked the rules of the event, and the rules of the event specifically say that this is allowed. And then I also went and checked with the referee, and I was like, am I allowed to just show the laptop like this? As long as I'm not touching any of the keys, the laptop's just there. And they were totally fine with that. So they said, as long as you're not touching the keys and they're just pointing at things on the screen, that's totally fine. So I made sure to be very clear with our opponents that's what we were doing, and there was no issues there. But it just goes to show the level of sort of scrutiny that all of these sorts of techniques go through, because they really are very like strong on integrity, and they don't want any players gaining any unfair advantage, and having a captain being able to provide specific instructions would be a massive and very unfair advantage. So just keep an eye out for that if you're trying to take a system like this and modify it for your own use. Just make sure that you are super clear with your opponents that this is the screen that I'm showing, there's no other tabs open, and I'm not going to Alt-Tab to anything else. 99% of people totally fine with it, didn't have an issue at all, but it is worth knowing that it is something that some people might have challenges with if you don't communicate clearly. But yeah, that more or less wraps up my role as a non-playing captain during the rounds. Obviously the role extends well beyond that, in everything from the lead up to and the formation of the team, developing the team culture, organizing, coordinating everything, liaising with the referees and event organizers, deciding on all of the major decisions, like, well, where is our accommodation going to be? How are we getting to and from the airport? What are we doing in terms of team lineup? Who's going to be on which faction? How are we going to manage that? How are we going to make those decisions? All of that in the lead up to the event. Organizing the dice, the shirts, the apparel, all of that sort of stuff, managing the website, creating in the Discord and updating that. There's tons of work that goes into that stuff. And then there's this, which we've just discussed on the day, in addition to making sure that we have our team huddles, making sure that everyone's getting updated, making sure that the coaches are coordinated, making sure everyone's getting their lunch orders on time, etc. There's all of that as well. And then obviously post-event, there's a lot of work as well, which is, reconciling the event itself, updating everybody at home, making sure that, the process continues on into future years, whether that be by having an election to nominate a new captain, whether that be by retaining captaincy. There's a lot of decisions to be made there. And then there's also a lot of things to be managed about, well, how are we going to improve year on year? Because that is always the goal. Even if you're coming dead last, if you just set your sights slightly above where you are and you keep going for it, you will slowly rise, slowly rise. I think there's a lot of teams come unstuck when they aim for a specific placing. They just want to come first, or they just want a podium, or they just want a top 5 or whatever. My metric has always been, and this is on a personal level at tournaments and as a team leader as well, and a figure in that regard, is always been like, let's just do better than we did last time. And obviously that's hard to do when you're captaining a team that has historically come first. It's obviously very hard to do. But at the end of the day, all you can do is try to get better. And if that means trying to come first and win best sports, or come first with beautifully painted armies, or come first whilst fostering a future generation, you don't want to come first at the expense of burning out all your top players and then they all drop off a cliff, and then you're left with no good players anymore, and future years for your team really struggle. You don't want that, right? You want to make sure that you're doing this right, and remaining in that seed 1 for as long as possible is the goal. And you can only do that if your plan is just continuous improvement. But yeah, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to go grab some dinner and a couple more cocktails. But that wraps up the coverage for today, and I'll hit you guys back tomorrow with some more.
Look for the blood god.